So you talked about leaving the show AM America in May, and that the show actually ended in October of that year?
In that form.
In that form.
Mm-hmm.
So it was immediately replaced by Good Morning America.
I believe so. I'm not quite sure of all of that transition because I was really out of there. But I believe that the first female co-host, and there were quite a few, of that transition show was Sandy Hill, who had worked local LA news. Nancy Dussault, the singer, was one of the female hosts of Good Morning America. She lasted a lot longer than I did and did a beautiful job. Nothing bothered her, or it appeared not to, you know. And there were quite a few women who came and went. And then, of course, Diane Sawyer came in to just stay there temporarily, and the rest is history. Yeah.
Did you watch the show when it became Good Morning America?
I did, but not a lot, because it hurt so badly. It hurt so badly that I knew, in retrospect, that was the chance at the brass ring, and you don't get more than one, usually. And even though it was in a work area that I'd never pursued, I still knew I'd had it. I'd been fortunate enough to be told I was good at this, that I was selected from across the country to do this, and that I had failed to help, and I'd failed to do well. I don't remember doing one good day on that show. And then as I began to learn, finally, how to handle migraine headaches, which in 1975, Park Avenue doctors couldn't do a thing about. I was given morphine suppositories for my migraine headache. They had no other suggestion. Well, all that did, of course, was make me throw up in a bucket during the commercial. 2 years later, 3 years, when I was doing Every Day, that charmed little show in 1978 for Group W, and we were shooting at Television City in Hollywood on the same stage that the Carol Burnett show had shot, with the same stage manager, Willie Dahl, and some of the same CBS network crew. It was called Every Day. John Bennett Perry and I were co-hosts with a cast of 7. Tom Chapin was one of them. Great talents on that show. But Group W lost its interest in the show and canceled us after a year. During one of those shows, I had a terrible migraine. And there was, on staff at that time, a CBS nurse. I don't know if that still exists, but there was a medical office on the property of CBS Television City. I went to the nurse and she said, "Well, now, have you taken your antihistamine?" I said, "Antihistamine? Don't you take antihistamine for your migraines?" I said, "No, I haven't." "What is antihistamine?" She gave me what I guess was Benadryl. She said, "Now, this is going to make you sleepy, but it will help your migraine." My life began, in a way. Or I should say, the end of my life was postponed because I was going to die. These wall-to-wall migraines make you want to be dead. So yes, it dried up my voice a little bit, and I wasn't singing so well when we shot the show that night, and I was a little bit sleepy, but you know, you're energized by the fact that you're doing a show in front of a live audience. And that was the beginning of getting a bit of help for migraine headache. Years later, of course, I learned through a physician here of Imitrex, which didn't exist, I believe, back when I first developed migraines. Imitrex, that when I have a migraine, which is now only maybe 4 or 5 times a year, I just give myself a shot in the arm. And it certainly changed my life. I was in a downward spiral health-wise because of it.
When you were having these issues with AM America, did you still have contact with Ralph?
Yes, but not a lot, in that every day was a pell-mell race toward the next day's show, and I would spend the afternoons in bed with a cold pack. Ralph occasionally was given assignments to roll in for the network show, a feed that he would research and do from out here in L.A. So he was trying his best to be a team player, and because of just the exigencies of time, he and I didn't talk often. I missed a lot of opportunities to get help. I could have called Ralph, and he would have given me the pep talk I needed. Here was another thing that happened. Because I was suddenly up in the stratosphere of high-paid talent, I got a manager, not only an agent, but a manager, who was a not very nice man, well known in the industry for putting packages together. I didn't know about packages. I later learned when it was of no use to me. And so he said, let me be the bad guy, Stephanie. Let me do the tough stuff. Let me get tough with these people and fight for you. Well, I said, Ray, I have seen how you work. You're not nice. And you're being not nice to people in my name. I can't handle that. They're going to hate me, and you're not going to get anything anyway. Years later, when he finally had, I'd given up on him and vice versa, he said, if you had let me do my job, you would be Barbara Walters now. Well, no, I wouldn't have been. Barbara Walters is her own machine. She's an entirely different animal. But I did learn later that, even folks like Meryl Streep, whom everyone loves, have somebody managing their career who may not be nearly as much loved as the performer is. I couldn't handle that. I had 2 managers in my career and left them both because of the way they treated other people in my behalf.
You spoke of every day and you lit up, as opposed to when you spoke of AM
That's right.
America.
It had everything. We had a fabulous band, a live band, some of the best musicians in Hollywood. Every day we worked together. We rehearsed on the rehearsal stages. Neil Simon's brother, Danny Simon, who would rehearse shows and doctor shows, he worked with us every day. The cast of 7, Bob Korff, who was a Broadway singer and turned into one of the best vocal coaches in the country, still today, was one of our singers. Judy Gibson from New York, who was a singer in her own right. Anne Bloom, popular actress, little sprite, blonde, who later became a psychotherapist, I understand. She was the smart one. And Murray Langston, the unknown comic who used to wear a bag on his head, and John Bennett Perry and I rounded out that cast. Rehearsals were showbiz. We learned to dance. Our choreographer, who became very impatient with us because none of us were dancers, I learned years later was Jaime Rogers was his name, and he was one of the main dancers of West Side Story. We were in showbiz. We had the same makeup artists and the same makeup room as all of the CBS soap operas, Three's Company. In fact, Suzanne Summers taught me how to get makeup off with Johnson's Baby Soap, which I still do. And we knew it. We knew we were having a fabulous time. It was in front of a live audience. We'd do a sketch 1 minute, then we'd do a group song, which was well rehearsed, and we sounded good. John and I would do a duet. Then we'd interview Tennessee Williams. We had a wonderful set with stuffed animals. It was a rare time. We'd eat at the farmer's market at lunch, from Television City in Hollywood. That was us. And then at the end of a year, Group W just lost interest. They had become involved, I think, in producing some other programs that captured their attention, and they let us die. It was a real heartache. But John Bennett Perry, my co-host, was then the father of a precocious 8-year-old named Matthew Perry, who grew up to be one of the friends who made $1 million a week.
Was he on set with you often?
No, but when I was at John's house once, Matthew was there. And I remember as an 8-year-old with his dad's arm around him, he told a very funny story about a guy who walks into a bar with a duck under his arm. And I thought, this kid is smart. And he was darling then, and he's darling now.
Are you still in contact with the family?
Not really. The last time I saw John was about 5 years ago when he was doing a play. He's a terrific actor. In fact, he and Murray used to go up for the same parts a lot. And John was doing a play directed by Jenny Sullivan, the dear friend that I was in acting class along with Murray and so many others. Jenny is a wonderful director. And so she called me in to read for the part opposite John. Oh, I was tickled, because I loved John, love him. But I wasn't right for the role. So my darling friend Jenny, who called me in to audition, had to say, "You're out." We've seen John once in a while, and we keep talking about getting together again, the old cast, and we haven't done it.
You sang the theme song for Everyday?
We did.
Oh, as a group?
Yes, and it was written by Tom Chapin, one of our group, and Tony Berg, our musical director. It was a magical year. Interestingly enough, it was exactly the same year that my sister Susan, who was 22, was dying of cancer. And because of the income from that show, I was able to fly to Minnesota every second or third weekend to be with her in our family farm home. We would never have been able to afford it otherwise, and that too was a wonderful gift, a wonderful gift. Susan was, there were 3 of us girls, and as our piano teacher said to me at her funeral, Mrs. Stepperud, who taught all 3 of us sisters the piano, Mrs. Stepperud said to me at Susan's funeral, "You know, Stephanie, it's a shame that Susan was the one to die because in ways she was the most talented of the 3 of you."
Such kindness and grief.
Yes, but I remember chuckling even then, because she was right, and I knew she was right. Susan was married in October and died in December, and the Everyday cast lived through that with me. It was a very rich year.
What was your chemistry like with John during the show?
It was good. We decided early on that we were going to get along. I think it was an unspoken thing. We knew that we'd better, because we had to be, very intimately connected as the 2 hosts of this kind of merry band of players. But it wasn't difficult. I grew very fond of John, and I think he trusted and liked me too. So that was another bonus. It's not fun to work with somebody you don't like. We've all been there. And John was no problem. I loved all of those people. How rare, a cast of 7 thrown together, and we loved each other.
So were there any favorite moments on the show, perhaps that came from faux pas or anything like that? Because when you're in an ensemble like that and you're singing and dancing and interviewing and interchanging things quickly.
I suppose maybe some of the favorites were born of the intense fear that each week we would do at least one big production number that was musical with a guest star, where we would also dance. So the guest star would come in to rehearse with us at least 3 to 4 days. McLean Stevenson, Andy Griffith, Gary Owens, and a bunch of others, and we all had to learn to dance a routine. Well, poor Jaime Rogers, every morning, you see, dancers remember steps from the day before because it's what they do. We didn't know dance steps, so everything he would teach us laboriously the day before went right out the window the night we went home to bed, and he'd have to start all over again. And he became very impatient with us, which I do not blame him for and didn't then. But I think some of those richest times were then, where we actually would pull off a huge production number dressed in costumes by Rhett Turner, the same costumer who costumed all of Carol Burnett's huge production numbers. Bob Mackie, of course, did some of those gowns, but Rhett Turner was a masterful costume designer. And so it was just full front-on showbiz, and those were some of the favorites. And then, of course, the little happenstance interviews with the little girl who had now just begun starring in Annie, which I could not help but to recall had been written on my back. It was just Charlton Heston came in with Murray Langston dragging him in a chariot. You know, Murray Langston was up for anything foolish and silly, and our guests were too. It was that kind of a show.
So how did your interview style differ from when you started with Ralph to that point in your career?
I guess I was just simply more experienced, and it was a looser show, so that I was looser. I just felt a little bit looser. And I was, at that point, ready to have some fun. AM America had been a disaster. I knew I was very lucky to be aboard another show, albeit syndicated, but it was being aired nationally in 1978, and I really wanted to make this work. I had Dinah Shore's old dressing room, done in wonderful pink and yellow and green plaid. Just a delightful dressing room, a living room, and a little sleeping chamber if you needed it, and a lovely little bathroom. It was pretty high off the hog.
So you did several acting roles in popular television shows like Love American Style?
Oh, yes. Yes, I did one or two of those. Each one was titled Love and such and such. Mine was titled Love and the Lady Boss. And I was the secretary to the Lady Boss, played by Nanette Fabray. And we were both in love with the same man, a proper English gentleman. And that was pleasurable. And I remember doing a Marcus Welby and a few of those things that came and went in spite of my poor powers to compete. But then eventually acting didn't really continue. And the kind of the end of my pursuit of acting came when I was cast and thoroughly rehearsed in the pilot of Sorota's Court. Michael Constantine played the judge. I was a young attorney. And this was an important step, but I was bumped from the show after the pilot was shot and replaced by the director's girlfriend. Now, that rolls off the back of a lot of actors, but for me it was kind of the coup de grace. I think I just kind of lost my spirit. And I don't remember really going up after much subsequent to that, although it was also at that time that I began being rather busy as the corporate spokesperson for Lucky food stores in the western United States. And I was still doing some morning television on a rather regular basis with some down years. Some years are lean, even though you don't see it on paper. There are lean years, and then you bounce back again, and nobody knows you've been gone. But the folks at Lucky Markets hired me to be a spokesperson for just a little battery of commercials they were going to do on radio and then on television, and if it worked, maybe we'll do a few more, and it lasted 18 years. I was busy enough so that I allowed myself to become a bit complacent, and I was also earning a nice little salary. The nice little salary, just enough busy work, quite a few public appearances, and the beginning of a speaking, becoming a public speaker at events, church groups, women's retreats on weekends, business organizations who would ask me to come and speak at their events and so on. And morning shows that came and went, but stayed kind of regular, so that I was kind of a familiar person in the western U.S. and certainly the Southern California area, made me a little bit complacent, and whatever edge I had for wanting to pursue acting again was filed down. I just didn't have the drive. I had the desire, but not the drive.
When did you start making appearances on Johnny Carson?
Actually, fairly early on. In fact, I think I was still working with Ralph And, you know, they find somebody on the air who can ad-lib. And in those days, they would go after new talent who could sit on the couch and ad-lib, even though you were very carefully prepared by their talent coordinators, who were very gifted. One became one of my dearest friends. Well, she had worked on the Ralph Story Show and then became one of the head talent coordinators on the Carson Show. And what they do is call you in for a couple of meetings where they discuss with you what your spontaneous conversation is going to be with Johnny or whoever the guest host was. So that when Johnny would glance down at that one piece of thin, it looked like onion skin paper, he knew exactly where that conversation was going to go. At least he did with me. But again, I didn't have the crust to fly far afield from that and do something scary and wonderful. If I had, Johnny would probably have invited me back. You know, Angie Dickinson was a regular because he knew he was going to get good material from Angie, whether it had been prepared with a talent coordinator or not. I was told by the talent coordinator that after my one appearance with Johnny Carson the next morning, where they reviewed the new people, he said, "No, don't ask her back. She's got nothing to say. She's got nothing to say." I had stuck to the script. And although I had a couple of anecdotes to tell and got some laughs, Johnny didn't want me back. I was called back 13 more times, but always with guest hosts. It would work okay. I would do funny things, funny bits. I would talk about recent experiences. I'd play the trombone. I'd make lutefisk, which is a Scandinavian dish. I'd teach the co-host, the guest host, the new exercises I was involved in. You know, those kinds of things. It was enough. But then after a while, it ended because I wasn't one of those unpredictable guests. I was way, way too predictable.
When you were working with John Perry and you were nominated for a Daytime Emmy for that show, that must have felt really good.
It did. We had by then been told we were canceled.
Oh.
Every Day had been nominated for the Daytime Emmy, but we had also been told we were canceled. So Group W said, "You can go to New York." It was broadcast from New York that night. If you want to, but it'll be on your own ticket. Well, John was busy with an acting gig, and just in case, I flew to New York, but as a courier. In those days, you carried film overnight from the network in L.A. to the network in New York, and if you flew as a courier and brought the film in a bag, you got to fly for free. I flew as a courier. 1978, 3 years after I had been living high off the hog in New York City. Now I'm nobody. I'm turning up in town to be in the audience in case we win an Emmy for a now canceled show. And the award ceremony happens to be at Lincoln Center, right across the street from my old apartment building. So in a moment of nostalgia, painful nostalgia, I crossed over the street and walked into the lobby of my old apartment building. And there behind the desk, the head bellman said, "Hello, Miss Edwards, are you back with us?" And I said a few words and walked out and bawled, sobbed all the way back across the street into Lincoln Center, got ready that afternoon to sit in the audience, listened as they announced the Phil Donahue show having won. And as we were all leaving, Phil Donahue and Marlo Thomas came up to me in the aisle and said, "We were worried about you. We were worried. We thought maybe you'd bag this one." And I got on a plane at midnight, carried a fresh bag of film from New York back to L.A., delivered it to ABC in the middle of the night, and limped home.
Wow.
What a tragic little story.
But in 1978, you became the host for the first time of the Tournament of Roses parade for KTLA.
Is that when it started?
That's right.
There you are. I hadn't ever been sure. Bob Eubanks and I argue about how many years we've done that parade together. It was the same year, huh? Well, there you are, you see. More of a reason not to pursue acting. Something, would happen.
So, had you watched the parade as a child or a young adult on a regular basis?
I was familiar with it, but when I first came to Los Angeles, friends picked us up at the airport, friends who were studying at the Pasadena Playhouse. And they said, "We have found you an apartment." I assumed it was in Hollywood, because Hollywood was where we wanted to live. They dropped me off at this apartment and said, "We'll see you tomorrow." And I lived in Pasadena for 3 days before I realized it was not Hollywood. They had just found an apartment for me down the street. So here I was in Pasadena, got a job as the secretary to 3 ad executives at Foot, Cone, and Belding in downtown Los Angeles, where I would commute by bus and hoof it every morning. And I was aware on January 1st, I remember, that there was this parade going on up on Colorado Boulevard, just within walking distance of my apartment. But I watched it on my little black and white television set and ate a whole box of Sara Lee pound cake while I watched it. Gave myself a terrible migraine. And never really paid much attention to the parade after that until I was asked to come in and try out again at Channel 5 to see if I worked well with Bob Eubanks, who was already there. He'd done it for several years prior. And how I would be able to work again in an ad-lib situation. They knew that I had, had some sort of a career ad-libbing in the mornings. So they said, "We're going to try you out for a year, see how you do."
Were you comfortable with the format of the show?
Of the Tournament of Roses
Yes.
show? Certainly, largely. Again, it was one of those shows where you had to sound as though you were ad-libbing, but in fact it was rather tightly scripted because the parade moves at a certain pace and you've got to know when to start and stop, and you have to say things that will trigger for the director who's sitting in a truck which camera angle to put on the float as it comes towards you, as it's in front of you, and as it leaves you. So they have to have some sort of a guideline. It has always been rather heavily scripted. Bob and I joke about the fact that we'd like to have a crack at that script ourselves, but that's not going to happen in this lifetime. So that being said, the Tournament of Roses parade is what it is. And Bob and I think, both respect that and now are comfortable enough so that we can throw in just a little bit of who we are and then get out of the way again. We can't go too far afield, or the little voice in our ear, we're asked to wear earphones, will say, "Next event, next event, next event," meaning we're off that float, stop ad-libbing, stop joking with each other, get on to the next float that now we're showing on camera. So it's kind of well disciplined, but it is one of those animals that really has to be.
When did you first meet Bob?
The day that we had, I think, a script meeting, as I recall. Usually what happens is that the day after Christmas, we tour the float barns, and we have always prided ourselves in being one of those stations broadcasting the parade where the 2 hosts really go and look at the floats. In the old days, our writer-director, Bill Rainbolt, a man who lived for the parade all year long, would have us dragged out to all the hinterlands, and we'd spend 3 days crawling under these floats and checking the gearboxes. It was hilarious. We still joke about it. Now we have, modified that trip so that it's a 1-day trip to the barns. But we still see almost every float, and we enjoy that. We've gotten to know float builders and designers and florists and the vast group of people who put those floats together because they love to. It's all volunteer work. They give up their holidays. It's the float barns are cold and drafty and wet, and you've got glue all over you for weeks on end. They love it. And so that's part of what gets us enthused for it. That's the first day after Christmas, really, is when we do the float barn tour, and then the next day we do our script meeting. The script is pretty much all ready for us. big books with lots more facts than we'll ever have time to share. And Bob, until recently, has kind of owned the scripting for the horses because Bob knows horses and has an experience with horses. And so he would write some of the horse copy. Frankly, this last year, I don't know if he did so much of that, but he kind of owns the horses and I kind of own the bands. You know, my own old trombone experience, gives me that credibility.
It's not your trombone experience, it's your experience with USC.
Well, that too, via marriage. My husband loves me, of that I am sure, but it is not the same as his affiliation with USC. In fact, just today, he called me to report that there has been a changing of the guard in the hierarchy of USC's athletic department. His voice sounded 15 years younger than it did this morning when he left. So we rejoiced. I rejoice vicariously, and I've learned a little bit about football, and I have a true visceral appreciation for it. And I love that band, but I love college bands. They're so wonderful, so brilliant, that really is a joy for me on parade day. I just want to talk about more, how difficult it is to keep those rows exactly straight. All the things I learned in the marching band I performed in all through high school, and we were one of the best bands in the state. And trombones are in the front line. And I was first trombone, which meant I set the length of stride for the band behind me. Well, I want desperately to talk about this during the parade, and for all these years, they haven't let me. Next event, so I never get to tell how much I really know about what it takes to march in a Cracker Jack band.
I may make a suggestion to
Yes.
someone about that.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Joetta. You
My
should
pleasure.
know.
So did you have a long-term contract with KTLA?
No, indeed. And it's never been long-term. It was year to year to year to year. And then I believe we came to a point where it was 2 years, and we rejoiced. And then something amazing happened about 4 or 5 years ago, where new management at Channel 5 invited me to lunch. Now, when a performer is invited to lunch, it's usually not a good sign. And the implication is that if you're in a large, expensive restaurant, you will not dare cry or throw a temper tantrum when you are fired over the soup. I knew something was up. And the new program director or general manager, I can't remember exactly what his official title was, said, "I know, Stephanie, that you've heard the rumor that I'm going to fire you. I did not invite you to lunch to tell you I'm going to fire you. I invited you to lunch to tell you I'm thinking about firing you." And there ensued the classic lunch where I sit frozen, knowing what's ahead. I finish the meal. I try to be personable. We make conversation. I leave being told that decisions will be made soon. And of course, within a couple of weeks, I was called and told that I was no longer going to be doing the parade, that it had nothing to do with me, that I shouldn't take it personally. And this is a phrase, that's a joke in the business, but you hear it. Don't take it personally, Stephanie. The fact that I'm firing you is irrelevant. We have great respect for what you did. And so I was gone for 3 years, and then something miraculous happened. Now, when you're in your early 60s and female, and you've been doing a gig for many, many years, and you are fired, you are not invited back. It doesn't happen. I make my peace. I'm thankful to God that I've had all those good years on the parade. I give my blessing to the gal who's going to replace me. I say to her, "Go in peace, my dear sister. I had my shot. Now you go get yours. I'm with you 100%. She does the parade for 3 years. Then suddenly I am called one morning, and I can remember it very clearly. Murray and I were making the bed. I pick up the phone. It's the producer of the Rose Parade, whose voice I figure I will never hear again. And I say, "Why are you calling me, Joe?" He said, "I've called to ask you if you'd like to come back to the parade." And I looked across the bed at Murray and said, "Murray, hell has just frozen over." It was the most amazing surprise I had ever had, certainly in my professional life. Stunned. Well, there'd been a changing of the guard in management, and they had changed their minds. And evidently, it was an interesting thing, and this was a blessing. It was kind of like hearing my eulogy without having to die. When I was absent from the parade, viewers had written or called in and said, "You know, Bob and Stephanie are meat and potatoes. They are also part of the tradition. If you'd fired both of them, we'd understand. They're both getting on in years. We understand that things have to move. But you fired one of them, and you fired the girl. What's up with that?" They didn't like it, and they didn't like management messing with what management did not understand was part of the tradition of turning in the parade. It wasn't because of my great talent. It was because they were used to us being together there. And so, after 3 years, where Michaela, God bless her, was valiant, walking into an environment where she didn't know any of the material that Bob and I have rolling around in our brains now from how many years? Many, many, many years. We've got more trivia in our heads about what that parade is than we'll ever be able to use. Poor Michaela comes up there and knows nothing about it and has to develop a rapport immediately with Bob and the audience. She was one strong cookie. I couldn't have gone through it. Well, anyway, management recognized that the audience had a stake in this. And to their credit and my amazement, they called, and Joe, in his inimitable fashion, our producer, said, "Yeah, we've decided you have got a few good miles left in you. We'd like you to come back."
There was a Betty White on being brought on to Saturday Night Live moment.
It was a small-time Betty White resurrection. Yes, it was. Wasn't she wonderful on Saturday Night Live? You know, Saturday Night Live, talk about a pressure cooker, where everything is on cue cards. But being the actor she was, she really wanted to have that thing under her belt as well. I watched her, and yes, she knew where the cue cards were, and she did glance at them, but she knew what she wanted to do. She had, every rehearsal counted, and of course, being involved in so many years of sitcoms, you have a terrific ability to memorize lines. And her career now, it's just spectacular.
Would you be surprised to know that the day after Gerald Ford died, that the Pasadena Star-News had a headline for you, and he was below the fold on the first page?
No.
Yes. Yes.
Well, now that's where the news business has fallen apart, in a way.
But they wanted you back.
Well, and it was Pasadena, and Pasadena has taken me to its bosom. Pasadena is a wonderful place.
How much longer do you want to do the parade?
Well, Bob and I laugh about how nowadays they check with us around October to see which one of us is showing any signs of senility. Can you count backwards from 10 to 1, Stephanie? What is your mother's maiden name? It's come to this. I just keep saying that I'm in it for the run. And Bob, I remind them, is even older than I am. So why quit? I've done enough quitting. And while I might like to restructure and tweak the show a little bit, I'm not even talking about it. I just go in there, and Bob and I, everybody else does the labor. We catch the baby. That's what we do on that parade. And we are paid well for it. We have a wonderful time. People seem to love us. At my age, in a business that I had no cause to pursue, I am really blessed.
Okay. Um, what in your memory of your long term with the parade are some of your favorite memories?
You know, there's a joke, a cynical joke that says each parade is the same. You could roll in last year's parade and nobody would know the difference. And in fact, they do run last year's parade in the very, very, very early hours before we do our parade each year. And in the middle of running last year's parade and this year's parade is the pre-parade show, which until recently, which was produced brilliantly by yours truly sitting in that chair, Joetta DeBella.
Thank you.
The pre-parade sets up the parade. That is that program for an hour where you learn the history of Pasadena and the parade and who the Tournament of Roses is. It's a very important part of that January 1st morning. I did the pre-parade one year for you. It was raining cats and dogs, of course, and it was a miserable experience, but it was one of the greatest experiences I had because I learned so much about the history of this tradition. As far as the great memories of the experience are concerned, though, I think it would be this. I hope it doesn't sound shallow. Our world is in such terrible pain, and on January 1st, it seems as though people all decide to be loving and to celebrate life together. I have to say it that way because it's so obvious. It is a visceral celebration of having another chance to start all over again. Bob and I very much feel that. We mention it to each other almost every year. It's a chance to start over again. And as superficial as that might be, it catches you in the gut. Secondly, then, and this is what I wish we could talk more about, the tremendous effort it takes to get there. These bands pay their own ways. They have pizza sales for years. Then they wait to see if the president of the tournament that year will select them, that band, to march in the parade. They don't know for sure. They start raising money years before they know whether or not they'll be invited. The horses are groomed all year. They're loved by their trainers and owners, their human companions. The horses feel it. The float designers are so gifted. The floral designers, if the weather turns bad, have to fly in new flowers from lower Ecuador overnight in order to make that float work. The tremendous efforts by people who just love that morning are very moving. Last story about this. Usually on January 1st, I drive home quietly by myself. Murray's often at the game, or he's squiring around my relatives from Minnesota, bless his heart. He gets up just as early as I do to get to the parade, but he gets none of the glory. So I'm driving home by myself, and I do a little grocery shopping quietly that afternoon because nobody's around in the afternoon of the 1st of January. I went into the supermarket one day several years ago, and the darling little box boy said to me, "I just came on duty. I've been watching your parade all day, and I think you were best on the third one." They rerun it, of course. I thanked him. You know, everybody's got a stake, whether they know what they're watching or not. And that is a very special place to share.
What time does your day start?
Oh, I get up around 2:30. But, you know, you sleep light the night before. Bob and I trade quips about whether we took half a Tylenol PM the night before or a whole one. In the old days, we used to take a whole one, I think. Now I take half a Tylenol PM because you don't want to oversleep, so you sleep very lightly. And so you're tired for a couple of days. But good grief, there are people who've been awake around the clock for months preparing for this. So it doesn't matter if you have to stay up or get up early. It's a privilege.
But you're you're located at on Colorado Boulevard, right at the turn.
Yes, from Orange Grove, that's right.
And how do you get up to your booth?
Well, in the old days, Bob, being afraid of heights, and admittedly so, would insist that I follow him up our winding, I thought rather rickety, stairwell behind the grandstand. It was a spiral staircase made largely of wood and kind of loose iron bars. He would say, so that if I fall or swoon, I'll fall on you. He would make me follow him up. But nowadays we take the cherry picker up, which is this, big box that you sit in and they hydraulically lift you up, bouncing. But I've been walking lately, trying to get myself in shape at this last 11th hour of my life. So next January 1st, God willing, I'm going to sprint up those stairs and surprise everybody. Yeah. I remember the old days when Mary Hart used to do it for one of the networks. Mary Hart, whose legs were insured for $1 million or more, and for good reason. You notice they never light my legs. But Mary Hart always did the broadcast so that her legs showed. She would climb their stairs in her lovely short-cut suit, and everybody would stop and watch Mary Hart climb the stairway up to her booth. Nobody watches me climb, I'll tell you. But this year, if I sprint up, I might get a little attention, because they know how old I am. I'm now very old.
Do you have any interaction with the parade crowd on that day?
Well, yes. It gets coldest at 7 a.m. We're in the booth about 6. So we're shivering by 7. We're pretty cold. And then the light is dawning. And we'll hear somebody, if it's a good year, across the street saying, Happy New Year, Bob and Stephanie. So we stand up, from our little heated seats and wave and hello and holler. And then at the end, we've gotten into the tradition of taking the beautiful bank of flowers that has been put in front of us and dismantling it and throwing it to the audience. It's a little embarrassing. You feel like Louis XIV, let them eat cake almost. But nevertheless, that's what they enjoy, and so we do it. We throw the flowers, and then if somebody wants to take photographs, we're there for them. You bet.
Is there still an element of surprise when you watch the parade? I mean, are there things that you're not told are going to happen? Or when they do happen, like pyrotechnics or something, it's still a thrill?
It is a thrill, because you're so grateful it worked. They have one shot in front of the cameras. They may do it again down the street, but cameras aren't on them. So you're thrilled that it worked, because a lot of money is laid on the line. If a corporate float works well, then the job may come to the same designer again the following year. So we're thrilled for them. I don't think there are really too many surprises, again, because a well-executed parade had better not have many surprises. They've been so fortunate. Floats are so tall, and then they rise, and then they turn that difficult right-angle corner, and there are light standards on the corner, and you're taking some chances with the amount of space now with these very ambitious floats. So we hold our breath a little bit, but we don't want surprises necessarily beyond what we've already been told is going to be the special element of a float. We kind of know what the special element is to work for, so that the cameras will find it at the right moment. Surprises we don't need. For the crowd to be surprised is thrilling.
Does Bob write notes on your script?
Yes, he does. He also does this. Bob, if he thinks I'm talking too long or ad-libbing out of turn, will reach over and slowly put his hand on my wrist and begin to squeeze until I stop talking. We've gotten used to this. One wrist is now slightly thinner than the other. I don't mind. And last year, having been invited back and flush with new confidence, I kept talking anyway. I've been reborn. He also is a practical joker. The very first year I did it, and I was nervous as a cat. You can imagine. This is live. You've got one chance to impress the audience, the boss, and Bob. who, if he doesn't like working with me, can say, let's get somebody else next year. I knew all that the first year. I was very nervous. He wound up a little toy, the description of which I can't really go into detail about, and sent it hopping across my script 10 seconds before we went on the air. We also have a porta potty up there with an open top. He climbed a little ladder with his camera one year when I had gone in there briefly to relieve myself. Well, this is Bob, and
Would you say he's the biggest challenge you have on
Bob,
the show?
Bob has occasionally been the biggest challenge I've had, but to know him is to love him. And people ask me, what is Bob Eubanks really like? Many people think we're married, you know. He has a wonderful wife and a 7-year-old son. He raised a family of 3 children long ago. As I said, Bob is even older than I am. You can imagine how much younger his wife is than he. Well, after he had this darling little boy named Noah, I said, how are you feeling this year? He said, I'm tired. Well, I said, it's your own darn fault. Here you are, raising a child at this age. He said, he's the wonder of my life. And he is. Bob is he's a new man with this darling little son. So people ask me, what is Bob Eubanks really like? And I have honestly been able to say, what you see is exactly who he is. Nothing more, nothing less. Bob Eubanks is Bob all the time.
On January 1st, 2002, the first Rose Parade occurred after 9/11.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
I
parade?
only remember, frankly, I only remember that we had to mention something, and we did. And it had to do nothing loftier than we know that we have been through much. And thank you for joining us again in a spirit of renewal. But the floats, the military entrance in that parade that year were something very special. I certainly do not have a love of war or war machinery, but I must say that when the B-2 Stealth flies over that parade location, because of the sheer magnitude of what it is and its accomplishment, we are stunned, almost speechless, and we shouldn't speak. Last summer, I was at an event where they are serviced every 7 years. There are a number of B-2s that fly around the world. I believe each B-2 costs billions to manufacture. And I was at that event, had the privilege of saying a few words to the gathered people who worked at the manufacturer and the military men who were there. In fact, I was sitting next to, in the blazing sun on the tarmac, to this young soldier dressed in full military stuff. We were sweating buckets. It was unmercifully hot in the middle of a summer day. And I noticed he wasn't sweating at all. I was just dripping. And I thought, oh, how dear. Military discipline. Young guy, probably his first time here at an event like this. He must be so impressed. Later on, they introduced the head chief pilot of all the B-2 stealth pilots, and it was this kid who got up and made the most eloquent speech I've heard in many years. That afternoon, though there was much I couldn't ask questions about, they were servicing one of the stealths in a huge hangar. And they said, would you like to sit in the cockpit? Well, I said, gee, there are so many other people who deserve to do this. I'm embarrassed. They said, well, we'll be happy to let you go up there. You'll be the only female, other than female pilots, and there are B-2 female pilots. You'll be the only female ever to sit in the cockpit, second only to Margaret Thatcher. Well, I said, I must go. And I climbed up these stairs and squeezed into the cockpit of this enormous plane where people fly for, I think they said, 40 hours. and they're like this. And I said, how do the pilots go to the bathroom? Well, they said, we buy a little porta potty from Home Depot. That's it. That's all. And do they sleep? Yes, they take turns. There's a tiny cot right behind you, and they take power naps, one after the other. But these pilots are so disciplined, so steeled, so experienced that they themselves are machines. They are machines. And the accomplishment of that machine that cannot be seen while it flies, it cannot be detected by radar. I said, as I was looking at it, it had what was coated with something like primer, an automobile primer color, that gray, dead color. I said, forgive my silly question, I don't see any rivets, nuts, bolts. I don't see any seams. And they said, no, you won't. And I said, who paints this? And they said, look over there at the far end of the hangar, and over here, and behind you. You see those tall things covered with tarpaulin? Yes, I said. They said, those are the robots. They paint the plane. Robots, I said. Yes, because the thickness of the paint has to be so uniform from 1 millimeter to the next millimeter that only a robot could do it. And I asked many other questions, and the fellow who was, the public liaison would look over at one of the others, trying to get permission about whether or not he could answer my question. And several of my questions got, no, that question we cannot answer.
So last year, the hero of the Hudson,
Yes.
Sully Sullenberger, was the Grand Marshal.
Yes.
Wasn't that marvelous?
Now that is a good pick. Some years the Grand Marshal, who each year is chosen by the president of the tournament that year, and the president holds that position for only 1 year. It can repeat, but they have it for 1 year. He or she has the honor of choosing who will be Grand Marshal. And this last year, Sully Sullenberger, the man who landed that plane on the Hudson River with everyone saved, was the Grand Marshal. That is a Grand Marshal. And as far as we could hear, the rest of the world saw it too. He is as humble a man as he appears to be. And they say, that he walked the length of that plane in water up to his chest twice before he emerged from the plane. He's just, he's masterful at the work he does. And I don't know that many people were aware of the fact that he taught that sort of safety feature to other pilots before he ever had to use it himself.
Okay, we're going to stop for a moment.